Today, I want to share with you 3 very common mistakes to avoid when using TanStack Start. So the first mistake has to do with how you load data in your application. And for this, I have created a very simple example. This is like a blog, and when you click on an entry, you can also see the content of this blog entry. If we take a look at the code, you're going to see we have a folder in our routes, and this is posts. And inside of it, we have this index page with all of the entries. And then we have a page for a single blog entry. And in both of these pages, we are using this loader function to load the data. For example, in $post ID, we are using getPostById, and you are passing in this parameter that we get from the URL to load the post and then rendering it for the user. And the problem that we have here is that this function getPostById is a function that does the direct database call. And this is problematic because the loader doesn't always run on the server. And this is one of the big misconceptions in TanStack Start, and that is that this loader function always runs on the server. That's not the case. This loader function initially runs on the server when you just open the page, and when you navigate to a second page, this function is going to run on the client. So in order to fix this, you can simply introduce some new server functions. And for that, I have created a new file, post.cs. And here we are just wrapping these functions that make the database calls inside server functions. And we are using create server function for that. For this, you can pass in an input validator. For example, here we're using Zod to verify that we only get an ID, which is a string. But the biggest advantage, obviously, is that this function always runs on the server. And this part of the function inside of the handler is the part that runs in the server. So when you call getPostById function on the client, this is going to do an RPC call, a remote procedure call to the server. The function is going to run on the server, and the response is going to be sent back to the client. So we can just simply copy these functions and replace the calls over here in the loaders by simply passing in the parameters. And this is going to be the data, and inside of it, we have our post ID. And just like that, we have fixed the first problem. The second mistake is how you link to other pages. And here I have 3 links. One is using the anchor element, one is using the hook, and one is using the link component. And there is a huge difference over here that I want to show you. So for the first link, we are simply using an anchor element. And here we are simply passing in the URL. And here you can already see that there is a tiny bug because in the URL we have a typo, and this should say page with params with an S at the end, and we are missing the S over here. So if you try to click on the link, you're going to land on a not found page. So that is the main reason to avoid using anchor elements when using TanStack Start. But that's not the only reason. The second approach is by using a button, and when it's clicked, we're going to call this navigate function with the link destination as well as some search parameters. Now, this navigate function comes from route.useNavigate, and this actually does work. Like if you come back to the page and click on here, you're going to see you do land in the right page. And you are also, by the way, passing in some parameters. But there is a big problem over here. For example, if you try to command click on here, you're not going to have that default behavior that you know out of browsers where a new tab opens. The second disadvantage is that you cannot copy the URL. You cannot just right click on this and copy the link because this simply is not a real link. It's just a button. And the third biggest problem with using a button is that search engines cannot see that this is actually a link. So when they're crawling through your website, they simply see a button and don't know that this is a link to a second page. Another advantage of using this navigate function is that you get this type safety. So if you pass in a wrong URL, you're going to get an error. And here you need to pass in the search because the search object is also expecting a page number. So if I command click on this page number, you're going to land in the second page. And this is where it's defined. This is our search parameters schema defined in Zod. And as you can see, the page number is not optional like the pages count over here. So you get all of these advantages, but you still have the disadvantages that it's not a real link, which means that the right way to link to other pages is to always use this link component. Here we have the same advantages as before. If you pass in the wrong URL, you're going to get an error. If you forget to pass in the search, you're also going to get an error. And on top of that, we also get this preload option, which allows you to preload the page in the background. And this is right now set to intent, which means when you hover over the link, the second page is already going to be loaded in the background. So when you click on it, the page opens directly. Now let's move on to the third mistake, because this one is actually very dangerous. So the first mistake has to do with middlewares in the context of server functions. So we have here in this example a simple button, and when you click on it, a server function is called. So if we go back to our project and open the terminal, you're going to see that we have a log over here. Client aspect ratio is printed over here, which is 1.777. If you take a look at the code, you're going to see we have a window dimensions middleware that get the window dimensions and then send them to the server function using this send context. This server function is using this middleware, and now we get access to these context values, and these are the values coming from the client. And this shows the flexibility and all the use cases that you can use middlewares in TanStack Start, and it's all very good. But there is one big problem, and that is that this context over here is the one that we received from the client. So theoretically speaking, anything can be passed here. In this case, we are calculating the aspect ratio, which means that a hacker could theoretically also pass in a height set to 0, and this is all gonna throw an error. So let me show you how a hacker would actually do it, and then I'm gonna show you how to fix this problem. So if you go back to our browser, I'm gonna open the inspector. Let's open the network tab, and let's click on this button, and you can see this part over here. This is right now the call that is made to the server function. And as you can see, this is the request URL. So I'm gonna copy this request, and let's copy it as fetch. And now we can open the console and define a promise for this. And we can take this URL that we get over here. I'm gonna copy it, and although this URL seems a bit unreadable, we can actually decode it. So let me open a URL decoder. And if you paste the URL, here you can see that we have server function, we have an ID of the server function, and then there is a payload that is passed. So let's delete everything other than the payload and click on decode. Now this turns the payload into some readable JSON. This is a very peculiar format, and I've seen this format being used a lot in TanStack Start, and at first glance it seems a bit unreadable, but if you take a look, you're going to see that we have, for example, here an object with keys, width and height, and then a value of 479 and another value over here of 145. So this value over here is the width, and this one over here is the height. So I can come over here and set the height to 0, click on uncode again, and then copy this part back. And then if you come back to the browser console, you can delete this original payload we have over here and pass in the new value. And as you can see, we have a server log client aspect ratio equals infinity, which simply proves that you can pass in anything you want from the client. So in order to securely send some extra context from the client to the server, we can use Zod for validation. For example, here we can define a new client context schema, and this is going to be these Windows dimensions with width and height, and we can set them as numbers, which are integers and have a minimum value of 1. Then inside of our middleware, we can introduce a validated context and use this context schema to parse the context. So if you pass in some invalid values over here, this line is gonna throw an error. And now that we have our validated context, we can use it in our code. Now if we come back and try to do the same thing that we did before, which is to make this invalid request, you're going to see that we don't get that printed output with infinity. And if we jump back to the network tab, you can see the last response. And over here, if you scroll, you're going to see inside of here, we have a message with an error too small. And this is this Zod validation error happening. And if we scroll again, message number must be greater or equal to 1. And this error is coming from the line 27 where we are parsing the input. So this is why every time that you are sending some context using the send context, then you should always validate it, for example, using a Zod schema. By the way, if you want to learn about TanStack Start, then I have just released my course, Learn TanStack Start. And here we go through everything you need to know about TanStack Start. So we start with the routing, and then we move on to data loading, all the patterns that you need to load data and show the different loading states. And then we move on to how to implement full stack functionality. from the client till the server till the database. It also includes authorization, authentication, and then we move on to advanced patterns. And a big part of this is how to use middlewares to simplify your code a lot. And we also touch on some really interesting topics. For example, static rendering, search engine optimization, API routes, static rendering, and SSR strategies. I'm going to put a link to it in the description if that's something that you're interested in. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.